Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Thomas L. Burton, who is Project Leader, Policy Research Group D, Ministry of State for Urban Affairs, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Burton received his education at Y College and University College, London, England. He has taught in England, in Canada, and in the US. His current duties include the management of a 3-year research program focusing upon the quality of urban life, including leisure and recreation. Dr. Burton has also been a consultant to the United Nations. His talk to us this morning is on leisure environments, people, places, and the polity. Dr. Thomas Burton.
I think I'd like to try and wear this thing, because I'm going to move around a bit. I guess if historians get 20 minutes and anthropologists get 10, somebody talking about policy and planning gets 50 minutes, I guess that proves once again that the planner is king. Actually, when Marv Rosenman first called me and suggested that I might have 45 minutes, I thought he was just being nice because he thought he'd better be nice to those SOBs who live up in the north. Apparently one infamous occasion, a certain US politician referred to us as the SOBs who live up there. Never mind, we still seem to get along quite well. I don't want to go through various kinds of definitions of leisure. Sorry, one of the things you have to put up with is we're not quite, up in Canada, we're not quite Americans, yet we're not quite foreigners. And one of the things that we do differently is pronounce words differently. Yet, we're not quite foreigners, we're acceptable. So I'm just not going to be able to switch to leisure. I'm just going to go on saying leisure. But I hope you know what it means. I'm not going to try and give further definitions, because I think both the previous speakers have identified perhaps some of the key components of the word. The first speaker, Dr. Edmonds, talked about the notion of the goal or objective, the Aristotelian concept. And Dr. Scruton started off by talking about the notion of free time. All I would say is that if you go through the definitions, and you start way back with Aristotle, and you end up with current governmental legislation in about 20, 30 industrial nations, what seems to be at the core is the notion of choice. Whatever else leisure is, whether you think of it as Aristotle's concept of self-fulfillment, or whether you think of it in terms of Thorsten Veblen's image of it as an indicator of social and economic status. Or if you come up to Geoffroy Dumas-Edier's notion of it being foremost pleasure and liberation. At the heart of all those kinds of definitions is this notion of choice. And it's this notion of choice that I want to take off from. I want to use that as my departure point. Because it seems to me that if one is talking about choice, then when one starts to look at the polity, that nice ancient word which simply means political system or governmental system, and the influence it has on choice, one begins to realize just how much or how important is the role of the polity, how important is the role of government in determining how leisure is used, the kinds of things we do with leisure, the range of choices that are available to us. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading this thing. I wrote this thing so that Marv Rosenthal would have something that he could wave around or give to somebody to quote. I want to talk a bit sort of to it. I think we can, by the way, you know we're really color coordinated up here, aren't we? I'm sorry if it's kind of shattering on you. If we look at government's role in leisure, then one goes back historically and finds that government has always played a significant role, whether one is talking about the ancient Olympics or the tournaments and jousting feasts of the Middle Ages, or if one is talking about the development of green spaces in the industrial cities of the 19th century, or one is talking about national parks, both particularly in the United States and in Canada, where perhaps the national park as a major governmental development is foremost in the world. Government has played a major role. But that has been a direct role, essentially a direct provision in some way of some service. What is increasingly intriguing is the indirect role that government plays in determining what's available to us for leisure. And perhaps most crucially, through the planning process. I recently completed a study of the federal government and two of the provincial governments, that's the equivalent of state governments for those who don't know, in Canada, and looked at every agency of those governments by way of interviews with key personnel in the government departments. We interviewed something of the order of 450 people, in-depth interviews, tape recorded, varying lengths from 15 minutes to, in some cases, 2-3 days. And we found that while the direct services provided by government were relatively limited, 66 federal agencies were providing leisure services in one form or another, direct or indirect, at the federal level. That's 66 out of 68. Treasury Board weren't. That's our Department of, I guess, I don't know, the one that oversees government spending, Treasury Board. They were not involved, but then they were sort of telling everybody else what they could or couldn't do. At the provincial level, we were talking about 50, 60 agencies again. Many of these indirectly through policy, research, and planning. And it's here that one begins to realize then just how important this planning role can be. Planning establishes the ground rules whereby private development, community groups, other government agencies may or may not provide leisure services. So I want to focus the rest of my time, and I'll probably not take the full 50 minutes, on this notion of planning. First, my one and only, first an apology. I had lots of slides. They went down to my publisher for a book that I have coming out in 5 weeks. That's the plug. Please buy it. That way I'll have lots of leisure. My publisher sent them back, but of course, the one thing that I think, or one of the things, there are some, one of the things that I think is worse in Canada than the United States is the mail service. I don't know where they are. They're probably in somewhere like Tulsa or somewhere like that. Anyway, they certainly don't seem to be anywhere in Canada. So I don't have any slides. I did bring along one overhead chart here that I wanted to use to open up what I'm talking about in this planning notion. And then I won't need this anymore. I don't know how well this is coming out. But what I'm trying to point out here, Rank Xerox gave me this one day when they were trying to sell me a computer. What I'm trying to do with this very simple representation of what it is that the planner is concerned with is to indicate the notion that we're dealing with a system, that it's not an open-ended system. What one has essentially are the kinds of things that both the previous speakers alluded to in varying ways. Up the top there, the notion of values, wants, needs of the population or potential users. And these determine something we call latent demand, which is a desire to undertake a leisure activity. There you are, I got leisure out that time. Something's getting to my subconscious. This latent demand interacts with a whole set of things, and I've simply put 3 here in this small circle, which themselves interact. The existing supply, what is there that you can use, can make use of? The personal characteristics of potential users. That covers everything from adrenaline and sex drive to money, ownership of motor vehicles, etc. This is perhaps one of the critical ones that tends to be neglected. Differential knowledge of what exists. One of the things that a number of studies have shown in the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada, particularly in the United Kingdom, is that one of the big factors affecting what people do is this, that some middle-class people either know where things can be done or know how to go about finding out where and what can be done. Some kid sees a judo exhibition on TV, says to mum or dad, gee, I wouldn't mind trying that. Well, in most middle-class families and upper-class families, they'll know where he can, or they'll know how to go about finding out where he can. Try it out. Lack of knowledge in many groups, not simply by socioeconomic stratum, but for instance by ethnicity too. Recent immigrants to Canada probably, for example, would not have this kind of knowledge. Anyway, this little lot interact to determine something which is called opportunity. And opportunity is the ability to actually do something. I may have a latent demand to climb mountains, and I may have all this, yet if I don't have this one, I can't climb mountains. The Rocky Mountains are out in the west. I'm some 3,000 miles away from them. Actually, there are some other hills that I can try. The point is that you need this latent demand interacting with all this before you get what's really crucial, that's opportunity. And then opportunity, when it's actually taken up, is participation. And participation then influences your values, wants, and needs. And the whole thing becomes a constantly evolving dynamic. Now, I wanted to put that there because what I have to say in the rest of the session is that this notion is neither understood nor really grasped in any, even in any sort of superficial sense, by most people who plan for leisure. Obviously, that was a pretty simple representation. It's much more complicated than that. Well, what does planning do? Traditionally, the planning process, and I think this is nothing new, has been portrayed as a static, linear, sequential process. It flows in a series of logical steps. Now, much of the argument that's been going on in planning and planning literature has been around how many steps are there? What activities belong to which steps? But at the core, you've usually had, whether there are 10 steps or 5 steps or something like that, is really quite unimportant, it seems to me. What's critical is the notion that it's carried out in a linear fashion. You start with goals. You refine those to objectives. You collect data. You formulate a plan. You implement a plan. Then you feed back to find out whether the plan works. This is a constant linear sort of progression. That's the traditional notion. Usually, too, planning is being carried out by a professional elite. Now, this is changing, and it's changing for a number of reasons. The arguments about planning nowadays are not on what is being done, but much more on who's doing it and how are they doing it. And what one is beginning to see evolve is an iterative process where goals are changed as you get more data. As more data is accumulated, this changes your goals because it gives you new insights. More data is collected as you change your goals. Your plan is adapted as you get more data. The whole thing is iterative rather than sequential. And it's increasingly something in which it is recognized that others must participate besides the professional. In a sense, I could sum it up. This paper talks about it a lot more academically. But I think what one could do is summarize and say that in many ways the planning process has gone through, in urban industrial societies like ours, like Western Europe and North America, has gone through 3 essential phases. The first phase I call planning of people, which was essentially that planners knew what was good for people, and all you had to do was manipulate the physical environment, and then later on, of course, they accepted that you manipulate the social environment. And everything would work out. So you had this notion at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in England particularly, where you built new houses for people in the slums and figured that this would change their whole social habits. And many sociologists were deeply concerned when they found that the people moving out of the slums into these new houses were still keeping the coal in the bath. They just couldn't understand why people who used to, of course, keep the coal in the old tin bath now kept it in their nice porcelain bath. And the reason was that's where they'd always kept it. And simply physical determinism shaping the environment is not necessarily going to change the patterns of social behavior. It may not. It's more complicated. Certainly this assumption, what I call planning of people, that you knew what was good for people, you knew how to change it. We then went into what might be called planning for people, when the planner suddenly realized that he didn't have a divine monopoly on knowledge, and said, well, maybe we should go out and explicitly find out what people want. And so we had this great mushrooming of social surveys. Everybody does. I'm sure you do them all in the architecture and planning school here. The big era in the 50s, late 50s and the early 60s of going out and doing social surveys to find out what people want of citizens who are getting more and more remote from big government and therefore are looking more and more to at least control what happens in their immediate arena. That also creates problems for the profession. One citizens meeting will give you a really good chuckle. The citizens committee all lived on this one road, which happened to have the bus routes. So of course they said, we've got to do something about all these bus routes coming down our road. It's bad for our children. So they came up with the proposal that the bus routes be moved one road over. There was nobody on the committee from that road. We tried to explain to them. They said, well, when they join the committee, they can move it somewhere else. In other words, I'm not suggesting it's easy. What I'm suggesting is it's a historical trend that's happening and that we're trying to do something about. Now, how does this relate to leisure? Okay, if we look at planning for leisure, if we take the notion of choice as the core of leisure, then it seems to me the purpose is to provide maximum diversity. Because choice can only be exercised if you have diverse sets of opportunities. The more diverse the range of opportunities, the greater the choice. Yet if one looks at how the planning ground rules are laid for provision of leisure opportunities in most cities in North America, one will find that what one has is in fact not diversity, but uniformity. One has something called standards. Now, it's true that opportunities are presented via zoning for the private sector to develop particular kinds of opportunities. But the general approach to the provision of public leisure facilities in cities, now there are lots of exceptions, and I'm going to point to some later, but the general approach is a standards approach. The notion of 10 acres per thousand, one children's playground within quarter of a mile of every home. And what do you see on that playground? The same damn thing you see all across the country. Swings, sand pits, baseball, what do you call them, triangle things. The same kinds of things. I'm not a baseball fan. I just believe in hockey. It's a religion. What one finds is that our cities, particularly, are operating to these standards. Now, one's not suggesting that standards have to be jettisoned, because after all, there is much of the city which can only be looked at in terms of standards. But what we found is that standards are not flexible. What we've found is that they're still putting diamonds, that's the word, they're still putting baseball diamonds in neighborhoods in Toronto that are inhabited by 95% Italians who all want to play soccer. A classic case in the United States, I'm not sure if I'm going to be shot for the law of libel here, so I won't mention the place, occurred when a children's playground was developed in a large Midwestern city. And no children used it. For several weeks, there was no children using it. And finally, the planner responsible decided, well, maybe you better go out in the community and find out why this was. And so they wandered down the street, and they met this lady, and they said, excuse me, could you tell us why no kids ever use the playground? She said, oh, simple, there aren't any kids in this neighborhood. In other words, it's not standards per se, but it's the perspective that we use standards for. They tend to become rigid. They tend to create uniformity in that one area of life, as both the previous speakers talked about, where what we're really looking for is innovation, diversity. And yet here are we, as planners, creating our standardized job lots. One of the slides that I hope to be able to show you was a classic in Banff. You see, we do it in Canada too. In Banff, the Rocky Mountains, where the mountains come right down into the town. And there, right in front of this mountain, is an asphalt playground with aluminum swings, a sandbox, and it's just totally incongruous to the natural environment. In fact, it's obscene. The standards approach tends to inhibit creativity. It tends to inhibit innovation. Now, there are exceptions. And what one is trying to suggest is that we need some other kind of approach. Now, I've suggested an approach which I call the leisure environments approach. And this approach it uses the same essential steps or processes. One's still gathering data, trying to find objectives and goals, trying to collect information, trying to develop plans. But one's doing it in a context which recognizes that all the facilities are part of a system. One of the intriguing things I find in cities that I've studied is that when a piece of land becomes available, usually you see there's no planning for leisure at all, but if there is, it's usually a piece of land becomes available. And then the question is asked, gee, what kind of park do we need here? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of leisure opportunity do we need here? It may have nothing to do with parks. Parks are only part of a system of leisure opportunities. And that system is made up of a whole set of different opportunities provided by a whole range of different agents. The private sector, the commercial sector. Private and commercial are, private is the non-profit making. Commercial sector, the public sector. That these all are trying to create a total environment. And the public role is critical because it sets the ground rules. Because it has the planning controls, it sets the ground rules in which those other two sectors can operate. And yet it's setting ground rules in the form of 2 acres here, half an acre there, a quarter-mile walk for every kid. If we start looking at it as a system, we may begin to say we don't need another dam park. Maybe we need something else entirely. And maybe that something else isn't something that the public sector should be providing. Maybe it is. But the point is that one begins to try and look at the total thing. One also tries to do it in a participatory way. Now, this sounds all academic, but I assure you this is what we're trying to do. And that's why both my wife and I are neurotic from time to time. This is the kind of thing we're trying to do, to try and work with people, with citizens. We've already got 80 pages of notes. This is going to be one hell of a book when we're finished. As long as again, we can't name anybody or we really will get hit for libel. But we're trying to demonstrate how the thing works. And basically what one's saying is that it can't work if you lay down a set of very rigid rules as to how you will proceed. The thing has to be flexible. So one's talking about looking at it from a systems perspective, doing it in a participatory way, and thirdly, encouraging innovation and creativity. Now let me give some examples of this. One of the best examples in Canada, and I don't know how many of you have been to Ottawa, is in fact the Rideau Canal. And this canal was built in 1830s as a military venture after that 1812 war between Canada and the United States. Incidentally, the war that both sides claim to have won, but of course, like all wars, only had losers. We built this canal, and of course, there never was another war. And this canal sat there for 120 years, 130 years. A few boats went up and down it, but not much more. In the summertime, it got used by a few boats. And then the National Capital Commission suddenly got somebody at the top who had imagination, who walked around the city. One day, he just walked around the city looking at things. Not looking at, with the idea that, you know, we need another 30 baseball diamonds somewhere in this city. But he looked at it from the point of view, what's there? He saw this canal, and he said to his staff, what the hell can we do with that canal? It's 5 miles long from where it leaves the river. It's a system all the way 110 miles long, but it's a system of canals on the river. And this last section in the city is 5 miles long, goes right through the heart of the city to within 100 yards of Parliament Hill. And they came up with the notion that you drain it in November, you let it freeze, you leave about a foot of water, you let it freeze, and then you simply spend the winter clearing the snow off it and maintaining it. You now have the largest, or the longest maintained ice rink in the world. You have it used by 500,000 skaters during a period of 2.5 to 3 months. It costs $150,000. That's 30 cents a head for the winter. That's the maintenance costs. They put huts every mile. Most of all, it's changed the whole composition of skating. Indoor arenas are used largely by single young people or young couples. What you get on the canal up that 5 miles is 80-year-olds pulling 3-year-olds on sleds. Rows and rows of 30-year-old drunks. Well, not quite drunks, but certainly it helps, you know, in that climate to have your hip flask. And at 2 in the morning, when nobody else is watching, the university runs classes for the diplomats' wives and the diplomats. They don't like to go out there when anyone else is watching them fall over. But the whole activity has changed the national capital completely. And for 30 cents a head. Because somebody looked at something that was there and said, gee, we could use that. The same thing has happened with other facilities in that area and in other parts of Canada, ranging from malls. The parkway along the Ottawa River, 10 miles, winds its way with beaches all the way along the parkway. But of course, the parkway itself is a 4-lane highway, 35, 40 mile an hour speed limit. People use it to go to work, in and out to work. Again, they said, why not? You know, who's going to use it Sunday morning in their car? Few people. Not many. Okay, close the damn thing to cars. Give it over to bicycles. For 4 hours on a Sunday, the place is just inundated with tricycles, bicycles, picnickers, the whole works. 2,000, 3,000. Temporal change. That's not a physical change, a temporal change. Just said, why do we leave it there for maybe a dozen cars to use? And again, it's simply having a sort of creative outlook or perspective. I can cite many more examples. What's intriguing, of course, is the agency that's doing this is not an agency that is bound by its role to provide a set of particular leisure opportunities for a city. It's not a city planning or recreation department. It's a National Capital Commission. And therefore, it's not quite facing the same kinds of problems as a city department might with a political responsibility. Nevertheless, what one's finding is that's rubbing off right across the country. People are beginning to look at natural amenities in the city from the point of view of what could be done with what we've got rather than building something new. We can make much more imaginative use of what we've got. It's not a question of using a lot of money to create a new facility. We do that too. The Ontario Science Centre, I'm sure some of you may well have been to in Toronto, which is just a riot. But I'll leave that one for another time. The notion then that I'm trying to suggest is that one has to get across that in planning for leisure, we have to give a lot less attention to a set of standards. Not throw them out the window, because they are guidelines, they're useful. But give a lot less attention to pursuing them at all costs, which seems to be the sort of situation we get into. the means to providing a diverse leisure opportunities for the city were standards. Those means became an end in themselves. And people started saying, we've got to have 10 acres. And when we reach 10 acres, maybe we ought to change the standard and suggest we need 15, which was put to me, in fact, by one of the park people in one Canadian city. Incidentally, a city which has tremendous natural amenities that could be used. That one does this as far as possible in a participatory fashion with people, and then one attempts to look at the total range of leisure opportunities to the citizens of that community. Now, granted, it's going to be difficult. I'm not suggesting it's easy. I know, I tried it. We're working on it now. But what I'm suggesting is that in the leisure field, planning is at a crossroads. We can go down this road using our existing tools and our existing philosophy and create more and more and more uniformity. Why does every McDonald's have to look the same all over the country? Maybe it's good for McDonald's image, but one wonders. I'm not getting at a sponsor, by the way. I could have said that of just about any. Now, why does every Holiday Inn look the same around the world, inside and out? It seems to me that we're creating more and more and more uniformity and standardization when the whole point of leisure is diversity. I can see why. If you look at Western nations, we all grew up, the United States, Canada, Britain, a number of Western European countries, with the notion of equal opportunity for citizens. It's a very important philosophy for us, equal opportunity. Unfortunately, somewhere along the road, equal opportunity has come to mean identical opportunity. And while there's no doubt that some basic needs of people are common enough that we need identical opportunities, health, perhaps in education, one can argue that case. While we can accept that, it's equally clear that other kinds of needs are quite diverse. And so that the principle of equal opportunity implies diverse and different opportunities. The principle of providing equal leisure opportunities means that Italians in Toronto should not have baseball diamonds, unless you want to try and convert them to play baseball. That gets us into our big business thing again. Our planning approach is sectoral and incremental. We do it, where's the next park going to go? There's a piece of land. Our planners, more often than not, are isolated from the people for whom they're planning. More importantly, in the leisure field, many of them are not planners. They originally got in the field as administrators of government programs. And then by default, they had to do the planning because nobody else was. So your parks departments who got in originally to manage parks now have to plan the damn things. The result, I suggest, has been not diversity, but uniformity. Okay, throughout this discussion, where I've wandered a little from my written paper, I tried to suggest that what's needed is some kind of balanced view between the need for planning for leisure, which in some sense could be argued as a contradiction in terms. But given that one has to, and I think the case for planning for leisure has been well made by numbers of writers. Given the need for it, we have to steer this balance between the need for it and the dangers inherent in an overly rigid approach when we're trying to create diversity. Unless planning is flexible, it'll end up denying the very concept of choice that lies at the heart of leisure. Now, I've tried to be somewhat learned in giving you this, and in order that I don't sort of take myself too seriously, I want to leave you with a quotation from somebody who said it in 12 words. See, now I've said it for 45 minutes. I can tell you who said what I've been trying to say in 12 words. It was Isaac Asimov, who in his Foundation trilogy, science fiction trilogy, said it really rather well. He said, to succeed, planning alone is insufficient. One must improvise as well. Thank you.